Welcome to For Podcasts. With me is Martin Plout again, our familiar guest. He is South African. He was Africa editor of the BBC. He's an author and he's a top-level spokesman. He does British military fitness dutifully every week. In fact, many times a week. Rumor has it he's much fitter than people less than half his age. So, Martin, welcome.
That's an exaggeration, but I wish you'd come and join us.
I will next time. I've been ticked off for being unfit, so I'll make sure I redeem myself in a few months. Martin, today we will discuss the country you were born and you grew up in. I grew up, of course, in India, a country which is complex, time-worn, and some would say infernally complicated.
And very beautiful.
Yes, so some would say. It is beautiful. It's a magnificent country. And South Africa also has tangled past. And today we'll make sense of South Africa's rich history. We were just talking a moment ago about the early years, how South Africa was formed, how apartheid was born. So walk us through that, and then let's carry on the journey and discuss the ANC and other organizations and movements.
Well, South African history, of course, begins a very, very, very long time ago because there are claims that the whole history of mankind can be traced back to South Africa, that you can find archaeological remains which show, the beginnings of mankind, and the early bones go back tens of thousands of years. So, we can't possibly go back to that.
Absolutely not.
But what we can do is let's say that the arrival of the Dutch in 1652, when they begin what was supposed to be a tiny shipping station on the way to India, where they could get fresh water, some fresh vegetables, but people were dying of scurvy on the way to India. And the Dutch East India Company, which founded it, gave their people strict instructions. It was not to become a colony. Well, that didn't last very long, and it gradually grew, spread, the British take over, and finally they take the whole of South Africa, which formed then into four separate colonies. There was the Cape and Natal, which were run by the British, and inside the interior were two colonies which were run by the Afrikaners, or the Dutch, who were the descendants of the original settlers. And they had gone into the interior not because they particularly wanted to, but because the British abolished slavery. And they were infuriated by this, and they trekked away from the British-controlled Cape deep into the interior. In fact, they went as far as Angola and Malawi to get away from the British, who weren't very popular with them, and fought many battles, but established these two separate states, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, while as the British held the Cape and Natal.
And fast forward to 1899 to 1902, we read about the Boer War. A chap called Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was an ambulance carrier in that war.
That's absolutely correct. The war was about many things, but it was essentially about the gold which had been discovered, say, a decade earlier, along with diamonds in the center of the country, and the British, who frankly hadn't given a damn about the rest of South Africa except the littoral areas along the coast until that moment, suddenly discovered that they were tremendously interested in the interior, and particularly the gold and diamonds, and frankly
What a
took
surprise.
And they launched an attack on the Afrikaners, who held particularly under Paul Kruger, who was the leader of the Transvaal. And they were beaten into a pulp in the first few engagements. Britain did terribly badly. They arrived with scarlet uniforms, with old-fashioned techniques, with poor equipment, and terrible tactics. And the Boers were hardy. They were on horseback. They had khaki uniforms, if they had any uniforms at all. And they knew how to run, and they certainly knew how to shoot. And they had much better artillery, which they'd bought from Germany and Austria. So they drove the British back, and it was only after Britain mobilized the whole of the empire. There were only 100,000 Afrikaners, men, women, and children, grannies and grandpas, but the Britain had to mobilize the entire empire against them, including Indian troops and people from, Canada, Australia, all sorts of places to try to fight and take the rest of the country. And finally, in 1902, they finally crush the Boers, and there is a peace agreement.
And before that, of course, as we were discussing, they put many Boers in concentration camps, and Boers and their servants. And as you said, 27,000 of Boers died, and we have no idea about the numbers of servants, black
Yeah,
servants who died. So,
absolutely true. And most of them were women and children, and they were amazingly tough because they actually, when the peace agreement was being negotiated with the between the Boers and the British, they send a message to the peace negotiation saying, if you decide it's time to make a deal, and by that time the Boer fighters were in rags, some of them run out of horses, they were in a terrible state. We will go along with your deal, but do not do it because of us. We, the women and children, have suffered so much already. We will endure more if you need it.
wow, it's a pretty hardy lot and a pretty bloody-minded lot.
They were, and the person who led the negotiation for the Boers was one of the greatest South Africans that has ever been produced, Jan Smuts, who was a man of stellar intellect. I mean, just to give you an idea, he had decided he wanted to go to Oxford, and he discovered he needed to learn Latin. He locked himself away for, I think, 10 days and passed his matriculation with a first class in Latin to do it. He was an extraordinary man. He'd also been one of the bravest of the Boer War generals, fought behind enemy lines. He had given the British an incredibly hard time. Now,
And he's immortalized in the film Gandhi.
he
Gandhi
is
walks in
indeed.
to meet Jan Smuts and he offers to pay for a taxi, I believe. No, he doesn't have money to pay for his taxi. He has to ask his
That's
subordinates.
that's absolutely right. I mean, Smuts has had great intellectual capacity. He was in on the British war cabinets in the First and Second World War,
Mm.
having made peace with them finally. But he was ruthlessly a racist, I'm afraid, at home, and didn't do anything good in South Africa. But one of the key things that he did when he negotiated with Lord Kitchener was that the war had all been about gold and diamonds and land. He introduced a completely new element. He said that the rights of black people will only be decided once we have been given our independence back again. It was an extraordinary thing because it had nothing to do with why they'd been fighting, but he put it as the first issue on his list of demands, and the British agreed to it was they needed to have peace. Britain had almost been bankrupted by fighting this endless war with the Boers, and they needed to have peace. They also knew that there was a war coming with Germany, the First World War, just 12 years later. They needed the Boers on their side.
So, long story short, the British agreed with the Union of the Four Colonies and agreed with the proto-apartheid demands of Jan Smuts.
Exactly. But what been happening in the background to all of this is that black movements and black people had begun to get their act together and to organize.
This begins by 1890s,
1880, 1890, there were
1880s, 80s,
small
90s, yeah.
institutions, but they were all very fractured. South Africa is a very large country, and what happens in one area doesn't true about the
Mhm.
others. The first time they come together was when the new constitution for the whole of South Africa was going to be drawn up and agreed in London in 1909. And a delegation is brought together, actually by a white Prime Minister of the Cape, Schreiner, and he leads them and he brings Indians, he brings people of color, mixed race people, and he brings Africans together. And they bring this huge delegation to London to say to the British, do not agree to a racial constitution. We in the Cape have had a non-racial constitution since 1830s,
Mm.
give us the same rights. And the British said, no, look, what we're going to do is we're going to have a compromise. In the Cape, you can have a non-racial constitution if that's really what you want. The rest of the country, only white men will be allowed to vote. So it was a two form of constitution.
So, fast forward First World War, Second World War. When does South Africa become independent from Britain?
It becomes independent in 1910, before the First World War.
before the First World War.
It's an independent country within the empire, just in the same way that Canada and Australia were.
I see.
And they then run their own affairs, and gradually it becomes, but it drifts increasingly towards the right and increasingly racist. And even men like Smuts are not racist enough for the Afrikaners. So by the 1830s, the rights of people, even in the Cape, African people in the Cape, to vote was taken away
This is when?
in the 1830s.
80, no, this is
Sorry,
1930s. I mean, yeah,
1930s.
exactly. It's we don't have a time machine
No,
yet.
apologies. I'm wrong century.
No, exactly.
So between 1830 and 1930,
Yeah.
black men in the Cape, it was a male franchise.
Male franchise. It was qualified voting. It
Yes,
was you needed to have property, and you
exactly.
needed to be a male to vote. But that was the same
We're saying in Britain.
in the US as well.
Exactly.
Most of the world.
Exactly.
Universal suffrage was a process.
So, but in 1930, that right is taken away,
Mhm.
and black people lost the vote, which was an appalling thing to happen, and it meant that they had no stake in the system, despite the British Prime Minister standing up in Parliament in 1909 and promising that the King would never allow the vote to be taken away.
Mhm.
And it was a tremendous betrayal of the people of South Africa, black and white, because it basically fast forwarded them from the 1930s, rising unemployment, of course, as there was across the world, and the Afrikaners drift towards the right and begin to see in Hitler a great idea. So out of the recession of the 1930s, the Afrikaners drift further and further to the right. They begin to pick up on the ideas of the Nazis in Germany. They begin to see them as potentially their allies. And in the Second World War, many Afrikaners refused to fight for Britain. It was a volunteer army, and it was mostly English people that went to fight. The Afrikaners, however, take power after the war, ousting Smuts, and form the new party, the National Party, which introduces formally the system of apartheid. In 1948, apartheid comes in, and that is the system that lasts right through until Mandela.
Till 1994.
Yes, exactly.
Now, we've learnt about how an organized white minority, largely Boer, takes over power. What is happening with the black population, with the Africans native to South Africa? What are they doing?
Well, they use the organizational capacity that they had brought together in the period just before the First World War, when the Union of South Africa was going to be formed. And in 1912, the African National Congress is founded. But it's not by no means the only movement. You have a movement of people of color and mixed race, colored people who had also had their own organization. And you have the Indians who also organized in South Africa and formed the Natal Indian Congress.
Yeah, Gandhi got his teeth, political teeth, in South Africa. That's where he experimented with a lot of techniques.
Absolutely, and fought Smuts. The two men had one thing in common, which was that they were both British trained lawyers, and you can actually.
I'm a British trained lawyer as well. Or I was. I'm a recovering lawyer. I have moved away from the dark side.
They fought each other very bitterly, but actually towards the end of his life, Smuts admired Gandhi and thought that he had done a great deal for the Indian people. But essentially, the African National Congress in 1912 is founded and becomes the main movement which unites black people in fighting for the rights of their people against an increasingly repressive white regime.
But it is a big tent party to begin with.
It is a very big tent party. When it was founded, one of the things that they said was, we are now going to put tribalism and division behind us. We'll bring all the peoples of South Africa who consider themselves to be African together. And that is the movement that leads the opposition. But gradually they also, shall we say, fall on hard times. And by the 1940s, when Mandela is a young man, he's rising in the ANC, and so are people like Oliver Tambo, who also become key players. They begin to question the old leadership. They want a more radical leadership. They push for tactics which the old leaders weren't prepared to go down. They also, although Mandela was skeptical of the Communist Party, which was mainly a white party, but did have black members amongst them, he gradually begins to see that the Communist Party actually were prepared to work with him, the only people who were prepared to work with the black people. In fact, interestingly, the Communist Party had a secret weapon. It was called dances. And on a Saturday
Ah,
night, they would hold dances, and people of all colors would dance together. And this was actually a very clever technique. And people, including Namibians and Zimbabweans, came and enjoyed it, and it broke the social barrier.
mm.
So, but they also, of course, were closely allied with the Soviet Union at the time. They were very radical. And in the 1950s, the Communist Party and the African National Congress bring together a grouping, which was the Alliance grouping, and they found the Congress of the People. And at this, they draw up a document, which, in a sense, is still to this day the founding document of the ANC, which says that South Africa belongs to all who live in her, black and white, and that no government that violates this has any right to exist. And that is the beginning of the alliance movement, which then fights the increasingly oppressive National Party. This all comes to a head in 1960 when actually a breakaway faction of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, who was skeptical of the whites from the South African Communist Party and resisted their role in it, they actually hold a demonstration. Police open fire on a crowd, and I think it's 100 people are killed. It outrages the world, and the anti-apartheid movement begins to form. But in the ensuing years,
Hold on a little bit, because if we go back a little bit by 1950s, early 1950s, Mandela opts for armed rebellion. So do a lot of young black South Africans. They get trained, of course, in part by the Soviets. And when he comes back, he gets to prison, where he stays for 28 years, if I remember correctly. So a lot happens in the 50s. And in a way, the apartheid regime breaks the back of the labor movement, then breaks the back of the ANC as well. A lot of the key leaders end up famously in that Robben Island prison. So the ANC and the protesters go through ups and downs during this period.
that's absolutely true. I mean, really, the clash at Sharpeville in 1960, which was the key moment there.
Mm.
Although there had been plans to launch an armed struggle before that, it was when the police were just prepared to shoot down unarmed protesters,
Mm.
ruthlessly,
Mm.
that finally, people in the ANC and in the Pan Africanist Congress both say there is no way forward. Interestingly, and this is just a sidebar. Subsequently, we've discovered that actually in Sharpeville, the
Mm.
police were surrounded by a very large crowd. They were in a fortified police station. Somebody in the crowd who'd been a crook and had been beaten up by the police, actually had a revolver and did take one pot shot from the crowd. And it was in response to being shot at from the crowd that the police opened fire and this terrible massacre happened. Look, I'm not saying there were,
Understood.
I'm
Understood.
just trying to.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a
yeah,
little
yeah, yeah.
footnote. That's all.
It's a little more nuanced than it's made out to
Slightly
be.
more.
Got it.
But
But the response was disproportionate.
completely,
Yeah.
and the ANC is banned, the Communist Party is banned, the Pan Africanist Congress is banned, and they are ruthlessly crushed and driven into exile.
Hmm.
And the 1960s and early 1970s was white rule, untrammeled.
Hmm.
Nobody could touch them. The army was completely ruthless. The police force was ruthless, and they ruled South Africa with absolutely no antagonism.
And they had a very good intelligence agency.
Very good
Boss.
intelligence agency in Boss, and they hunted down people even abroad.
So whilst all of this is going on, some people are inspired by 1968 in the US and the UK.
That's
And
absolutely true.
these young people start organizing and start a labor movement. Apparently you were one of them.
I was. This
Yeah.
is this is absolutely true. It actually begins in 1968 at the University of Cape Town. A black lecturer was appointed to the university to teach comparative African government and law. He was very well qualified. Archie Mafejo is his name. And the government just said, this is an outrage. Cannot appoint a black lecturer to a white university. This was pure apartheid at this time. And the governing body of the university backed down and withdrew his appointment. And we marched down to the administration building and we sat in for 9 days. And
Very Gandhian of you.
it was. We were very Gandhian in that we made sure that everything was very clean and neat after we left. But it was the first ripple of resistance, and a lot of us then fell out. I dropped out of university. Many of people did. Some of our parents would never talk to us again because of what we'd done.
Mm.
It was a tiny event, but by the 1970s, when I went back to university in Cape Town, there was already a small grouping which had begun to be formed by the National Union of South African Students to begin to campaign against the appalling wages that were being paid, let's be honest, by our fathers who ran the mines and the factories. And we were ashamed of the way in which people were being paid starvation wages. There was a fantastic article which was published in Britain and then republished in South Africa by Adam Raphael called Starvation Wages. And that was, they were accusing British companies of just living off the most appalling wages in South Africa.
And it was common elsewhere in the empire too.
That's true.
It was slavery, indentured labor, starvation wages. You could argue that bit by bit, as consciousness increased, slavery went out, then indentured labor came in, then starvation wages came in, and then eventually working conditions improved. But it was a process over many centuries.
That's absolutely true. Anyway, so by the time I got back to university in 1973, there was this small group of South African white students, most of them at the University of Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Natal. And we began organizing to do in the most pathetic way. We'd publish little pamphlets. We would begin to distribute newspapers, which we wrote in English. I mean, what did we know about wages or trade unions? Absolutely nothing. But we tried to propagate the idea that people should organize. And we went into the townships and we found people who had done the organizing in the 1950s for the ANC and its trade union wing, SACTU. And we linked up with them. And by hook or by crook, and by distributing newspapers to outside factories and getting people to come and demand the most tiny things. For example, at the time, it was a lot of factories didn't even give a wages slip on which you noted down why deductions being made, what the taxes were, what the payment was made for a week's work. They hadn't even been doing that. And even in South Africa, that was legal. So we began campaigning about things like that. You have a right, we told workers, to get a wages slip so you can see what happens. And they began campaigning on these micro issues. And out of this, gradually a system of organized committees came, and out of the committees gradually came the unions. And within 18 months, 2 years of our initiative, as I said, we were pretty useless, but we gave people the sense of confidence. They also went out and strike in Durban in 1973 spontaneously, huge strikes. And there was a gradual feeling that workers were not going to put up with being paid these terrible wages anymore. And after about 2 years, there was incipient sort of union structure. And they said to us, look, you students have done a decent job, but really, thank you, goodbye. You can do a bit of campaigning for us, but that's all you can do. We can stand on our own feet. And out of those unions come the powerful organization called the United Democratic Front, which was civic organizations based in the townships and the unions, and they took on the state.
So you were the capitalists in a small way.
In a very
A group
small
of you
way.
were,
In a very
the
small way.
formation of the unions and then leading up
Yeah.
to this United Democratic Front.
But I mean, the people who really took who really should be, given the credit were either the old organizers who'd been in the unions in the 50s and the workers themselves who risked everything in taking on the management. I mean, they could not only lose their jobs, there were lots of
Yeah.
spies, they could have been attacked, they could have been beaten up, all sorts of things.
Oh,
But
and
they were
sent to prison.
exactly, but they were so desperate that they would do this. And it is out of that rather, and of course, at the same time, there was a big international movement around the world led by the anti-apartheid movement, which was based here in London. And the ANC and the Communist Party mobilized people across the world, including from the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
and they launched, as you said, the armed struggle, which Nelson Mandela had initiated back in the 1950s and 60s. They tried to initiate the armed struggle, but the armed struggle was almost hopeless
It didn't
because
go anywhere.
but look, they did let off the odd bomb. There were the odd
Mm.
things that happened, and black people would listen carefully to what their underground radio station, which was broadcast on FM on shortwave from abroad, they would listen to what they were saying, and they took confidence from these occasional bomb attacks or occasional clashes with the police, but they were pretty small scale. The real thing that broke the apartheid state were two factors. One was what I mentioned, the United Democratic Front, which led endless protests, very brave protests, taking on the police, confronting them. And the police war was quite a small group. And abroad, there was a movement to disinvest from South Africa. And it was when the New York teachers said to their pension fund, you may not invest in South Africa anymore. Suddenly, the South African government woke up and thought, my goodness, if we don't settle, we won't have access to foreign capital. And it was the combination of all of these factors, the armed struggle, the resistance in the country, and the disinvestment campaign. Each one failed on their own. Together, they convinced the
Mm.
apartheid
It
government
was
to
perfect
settle.
storm. I remember growing up in India, and India was rather proud of leading the non-aligned movement
Absolutely.
against apartheid. And that was partly because of Gandhi's legacy,
Yeah.
and partly also because Indians viewed the Anglo-Saxon, and of course they conflated South Africa with Anglo-Saxon imperialism because they saw
Absolutely.
the US and UK backing South Africa as the big unfinished battle. So it was an interesting time, but let's go back to something more nuanced. And the point that the African National Congress, the ANC, wasn't exactly in favor of the unions. It wanted control by the 1970s when the United Democratic Front appears. The ANC, even at that early stage, even 20 years before it has acquired political power, wants resistance, but it wants resistance under its umbrella.
That's absolutely correct. And I mean, I discovered this in two ways. First of all, in the 1970s, when I was working with the Wages Commission with the students, we
Mm.
actually got a message from Lusaka in Zambia, where the ANC was based, saying, you must stop this organization. South Africa is a fascist state. It is impossible to organize openly in a fascist state, and you must stop misleading the workers. The ANC and its trade union links were wrong. They had been outside the country so long they did not see that
They had lost touch.
there was this gray area where you could sort of organize, and over time we did. They were wrong, and frankly, we were right. The second time I came across this was, we now fast forward, and I leave South Africa in 1977, and I come to Britain. I do a degree, and I went to work then for the British Labour Party, and for 5 years until 1983, when I go and work for the BBC, I was the Africa Secretary and the Middle East Secretary, the Africa Secretary for the Labour
Mm.
Party. And one of the first things I came across when I arrived at the headquarters was a document which said that the Labour Party was going to recognize the African National Congress as the sole legitimate representative of the people of South Africa. And at first I thought, this sounds sensible. The ANC is the biggest organization. Then I thought, hang on, that means that the Labour Party will be forbidden from talking to the unions that I had done my small bit in trying to help get going without the ANC's permission. We cannot talk to other organizations. For example, there were some white opposition movements. There were in South Africa, there were Indian movements. There was the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was recognized by the UN as a legitimate organization. And I thought, we can't go along with this. So I went to my boss, who'd only just appointed me, and I said, look, this is a mistake. And she said, what do you mean? And I explained. And she then called a meeting with myself, her, and her boss, who was a member of parliament, Joan Lester, very fiery but very upright woman in the Labour Party. And we then met with the ANC, who sent 4 members, including Abdul Minty and other people, Solly Sachs, who was the head of the ANC in London. And they said, well, why are you resisting this? And I went through the things and I said, look, this is a decision which only the people of South Africa can take, who their elected representative is. And we would be going against the United Nations, which recognizes not just the ANC, but the PAC and other organizations too. So we can't do it. It's not for the Labour Party to do this. And although they hated my guts for saying it, and they spread rumors that I was an agent of the South African state.
Boss.
Yeah.
A boss agent.
They couldn't find a reason to, and the Labour, they couldn't find a reason for rejecting it. And the Labour Party did not endorse the ANC as the sole legitimate representative of the people of South Africa. I mean, it was a stupid. I mean, the ANC should never have gone down that path. It was, I'm afraid I'm enough of a Democrat to believe that the only people who have the right to give you power are the people, and you either win a vote or you deserve to have power. And
Indeed.
I still believe that to this day.
Indeed. So we talked about how apartheid fell and how the ANC then takes charge. But it seems from what you're saying, the ANC had ceased to be a big tent party and had become a much smaller tent, expat-led organization by now.
That is true up to a point. But first of all, the 2 things one must bear in mind. The one thing is that they stayed true to the position they'd taken in 1912. They never became a tribal party.
Okay, so that's a huge achievement.
Absolutely, a huge achievement. So, for example, the 2 major ethnic groups within the black population, the Xhosa and the Zulu, are both represented, always have been inside the ANC, plus all the other groups, and they will resist tribalism at all costs. So they deserve respect and credit for that. And the other thing was that they also got a lot of new young members. Because in 1976, the children of Soweto rose against being told they had to be taught in Afrikaans and living under apartheid. And they went onto the streets, and there were hundreds were shot down. And many of them said, well, we can't live under this. And they went into exile and fled and tried to return to fight an armed struggle. It didn't really work, but the ANC did get a new infusion of younger people into their organization, which was enormously helpful. So when they come to power in 1994, they really have many things at their disposal. They had these young people who'd been in exile, they had their fighters, even if they hadn't been hugely successful, they had played a role. And they have all these other organizations like the United Democratic Front and the unions. The problem is that they suck everything into their one organization. And they
create a one-party state.
Almost. I mean, it never became a one-party state, but that was, in a sense, the way that they regarded it. They saw themselves as the only legitimate force within there. And it has taken the most enormous resistance from many other organizations to prevent that happening.
And there were many organizations all through, from the sounds of it. So many different organizations, both civic and political.
Exactly, including a lot of journalists, media who are independent and prepared to stand up to the ANC and it's sort of totalitarian-ish. They were never totalitarian, but there was authoritarian,
maybe a better word, because they weren't exactly Uncle Joe Stalin.
No,
but
although many of them looked up to Joe Stalin.
In India, we have a chief minister called Stalin, named after Stalin.
There you go.
In Tamil Nadu. So okay, we looked up to Stalin too. And so the closest parallel then is the Indian National Congress, which after independence turns authoritarian, and indeed it turns extremely authoritarian when Indira Gandhi is in power and she locks up the entire opposition for 2 years. So it seems they were drifting down the ANC was drifting down the INC path.
I think that's true, and I also haven't forgotten what the forced sterilization that Mrs. Gandhi brought in, which was some of which was really appalling.
Oh, well, amongst many other wonderful things.
Yeah. I think the great thing that one can say about South Africa and India is that both countries, partly because of their history and the fact that the court system and the newspapers, the journalists, fought repression both under the colonial system and in the post-independence situation, that people have an affection for independent alternatives to the government and to the ruling party. And I think it is that
we can see that after the latest election,
exactly,
in which the ANC stands severely weakened, and which you very kindly covered for us and analyzed for us.
Exactly, but there's this deep affection for alternative sources of information in both countries
and organizations,
and from both organizations. And I think that comes out of that culture and history. And without the history, you can't understand why both countries, both India and South Africa, have, in my view, hopeful trajectory forward, because they have democratic roots which are deeply within their culture.
Indeed, on that very positive and optimistic note, Martin, thank you so much for your time. I'm about to fly off from London to Washington, and this is the last podcast I'm doing from London. And Martin has been very kind to make time from a very busy schedule. He's finishing a book to speak with us. So thank you once again. And those of you listening, make sure you follow us on whatever medium you're listening, whether it is Apple Podcasts or Spotify or in the future YouTube. Make sure you sign up to our newsletter. And from Atul Singh in London, it is bye for now. Thank you, Martin.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.